بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله المبعوث رحمة للعالمين. أما بعد, I wanted to come back to this point on suspecting the claim made by contemporary students and scholars of Ilm Kalam that Ilm Kalam by itself is going to safeguard many from atheism. And in that presentation, or that title that I just gave, I'm giving myself some room to be wrong. Personally, I don't think that the study of Ilm Kalam is going to safeguard people from atheism and doubting in the deen, contrary to the claim that's being made by many. And it's not that I don't believe in the power of reasoning and so on and so forth, and at times the necessity of philosophy and maybe even the utility of some points of kalam. The problem is not that. The problem is that what is being pushed as a solution to the crisis of Aqidah amongst Muslims, that we turn to Ilm al-Kalam and our issue will be solved. We will be inoculated from the virus of disbelief, is just a false claim. One of the things, and I tried to bring this up yesterday, and I ended up deleting the videos, I believe. I left it for the few that listened and then I took them down. But one of the things that is important to understand, and I'll mention this again and I'll mention it over and over again. What we're confronting in today's time is not going to be solved by studying an Aqidah book or two. It's impossible that the crisis is going to be addressed in that way. Part of the dilemma that we have as Muslims is that we want to negate the importance of civilization and culture. We want to negate the importance of interdisciplinary work. And we find this amongst those who push a strong Salafi da'wah. We find it among some of the Sufis that think that if we were to retreat into a nice tranquil place and focus on the awrad and the basics of Fard al-Ain, that will be sufficient to inoculate us. And then we have the camp that tells us that if we study Ilm al-Kalam, that's going to work. That's just not the case. If we were to take a book like Al-Muwaqif by Al-Iji, we're going to see that Imam Al-Iji in that book of Kalam is attempting to integrate in his discussion on rationally establishing the existence of Allah. He's relying on physics, the physics that was being taught in his time, the sciences that pertain to speaking about the natural phenomena that we experience and we see and we engage with. You know, he was using those sciences to make an argument for the existence of Allah. I personally don't think that it's sufficient to establish intellectually in your mind through a series of arguments that Allah exists, that's going to give certainty. If that was the case, why would it be that the Quran was sent to us? That's a whole argument in itself. But I want to say that those attempts to explicate, clarify, establish the existence of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala in the past, they came out of a civilization that was established, a Muslim civilization or series of civilizations that the Muslims created. And so when the Muslims were arguing at this level by this point in time, not today, but in the past, the time when they are establishing rational proofs for the existence of Allah, so on and so forth, they were leading the world. They were not the underdog in the world. They were the pioneers of science. They were the pioneers of mathematics. They were at the front line of university education. Then we find that the people of the book, in specific the followers of Musa and Isa, they followed the Muslims in the Kalam trajectory. But that changed with the modern world. The understanding of natural phenomena completely flipped when people like Descartes and others established a new paradigm. Descartes intentionally wanted to flip the paradigm of how we understand the world and put it on a different intellectual platform. And by that time that he was able to at least rock the foundations through his system of doubt, which some say he borrowed from Abu Hamid al-Ghazali, rahmatullah alayh, but he flipped it the way that he wanted to flip it. By the time he did that, if you look at the Cartesian experiment and the meditations, and you see what it was that Descartes did a thought experiment. And I encourage some people that have a strong foundation, not everyone, to check out what he did. Descartes doubted in his own existence. He doubted in the existence, he doubted his own physical existence. He doubted in the existence of the natural world that we can see. And then he doubted in God's existence. Then he said, in this doubt experiment that he had, he claimed that there was the shaitan that caused them to doubt in everything. He never doubted in the shaitan in the example, but he doubts in God, he doubts in the world that he can see, and he doubts in his physical existence. The only thing that was left that kept Descartes from believing in something was, he said, something the doubter is thinking. And so then from there he established his own existence, but he was never able to reestablish his physical existence. He established himself as a person in thought. And that's the foundation of Western society, where we can have a long discussion of how that has impacted not only the legal system, but medicine, the mind and body problem, the approach of doctors to the body, looking at the body as a machine, looking at animals as machines, looking at nature the way that is looked at. And there's others that thought about the world in a very violent way, like Francis Bacon, who believed that the natural world was full of secrets and that the natural world had to be tortured so its secrets were taken from it. So we have a whole series of thinkers in the West that laid down a way of looking at life that has influenced mathematics, it has influenced ethics, it has influenced a concept of beauty, a concept of meaning, how we do art, how we do architecture, how we understand psychology. Freud came on the scene and replaced the whole concept of the soul with a whole series of ideas, which up to now psychology has barely recovered from the damage that was done with that. Marx came on the scene and said that the driving force in human reality is historical change. And so the reality of history became everything. And there's a whole series of discussions that have to be had to unpack that, and I'm not going to get into that. But what I'm going to say is that there's architects, intellectual architects, which have shaped the way that contemporary societies understood there were some advances that were made, like our ability to speak to each other by these types of mediums. There's no doubt that the Muslims had laid down the foundations of logic in the that preceded the logic that we have today, that eventually went into the logic that is used in computer languages, that eventually paved the way for us to be able to communicate the way that we communicate. So the reality at the end of the day is that we stopped building civilization. So Ilm Kalam by itself is not going to stop people from doubting, because you can study a series of arguments about why you think Allah exists, and your mode of thinking still be a mode of thinking which is supporting kufr. Because the mode of thinking which many of us have gained, that at the bottom line supports kufr, is coming from a lot of different directions. It's coming from popular culture. You know the concept of do you know what I'm saying? Or we say that's the way that it is. There's a whole series of sayings that we say on a daily basis, that when we go deeper into them, how can we say do you only? You understand what I'm saying? Where's the other angle of that? Where's the angle of the halal and the haram, of the ethical component? Where's the reality that we are born into community and we have rights and responsibilities over each other? We understand the concept of look for your own interests, but what does that mean as a Muslim? Does it mean that I look after my own interests to the detriment of others? Because that's exactly what modern philosophy has put forward. That's exactly what came out of the modern experiment. That's exactly what came out of Descartes. I can prove my existence, but I can't prove your existence. So I know what I can do for my interests, but I have a problem ethically when it comes to me dealing with you. And it's the same thing when we start going into other branches of philosophy like existentialism, which is still impacted by the same level of individuality, which we see with Descartes. And so the issue comes up that my freedom is absolute, even if it means denial of Allah, even if it means that I trample your rights. Just don't trample my freedom. Don't trample on me. And so there's a lot of ideas that come into play, like, for instance, the role of science and religion, how it's constantly questioned. Christianity and the scientific mind didn't mesh very well. That wasn't the case in Islamic civilization. But the Muslims definitely went backward at some point in time. The Muslims definitely declined. So for those that claim that just studying Ilm Kalam is going to safeguard people from atheism and leaving the deen, that's a crock pot of insanity to think that. The Muslim community, in order to safeguard ourselves from atheism, we would have to revive the way that we look at the world in various disciplines of science. How we deal with the human psyche, how we deal with emotions, how we look at instinct, how we look at the natural world, right? How we deal with the problems of life, how we deal with the concept of despair, how we deal with the issue of doubt, and how it is that we look at the relationship between the world and God and ourselves. If we're going to think that we're going to use arguments that were made hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years ago, and that's going to be enough to protect our people from doubt, then that's just a plain illusion. You understand what I'm saying? That's not going to work like that. The Kalam school has a lot of work to do. The Kalam school, it can't exist and evolve itself without evolving philosophy. And philosophy right now is in a dung pot, so to speak. Philosophy has been collapsed in the West. The Western intellectual is collapsed. The Western intellectual no longer believes in reason. The Western intellectual is a person that is in a state of mental breakdown, right? And that's what you see in the society. That's what you see in the society. Psychology as a discipline by itself is no longer able to produce rationally the way that it produced. That's why what you're finding in the psychological discipline is they're turning to the Buddhists to understand the mind. And everything is mindfulness and this and that. because now they have to turn to other sources to understand the human psyche, because their trajectory, their experiment in understanding the human being has failed. We're in a predicament where we have to understand what is going on within Western society, including the US and including Europe. And we have to understand that Western society is in decline. Don't bring me the end of the world scenario. You know what I'm saying? Don't tell me the last days, the end of times. No, what's ending is Western civilization as we know it is in decline. So that's the issue of our predicament with life and belief in God is not going to come by sitting here trying to rationalize or sitting here trying to take on arguments that were made in the past. We have no choice but to build. We have no choice but to renew ourselves. You know, the answers are not going to come just by looking in the past and then projecting them into the future. There's work that we have to do intellectually in the now. So the Kalamists that don't admit that there's work that has to be done, they're going to do a lot of damage. This is why for years I stayed away from talking about this stuff. I saw this as a Catholic. The Catholics themselves have the same dilemma. The Christians themselves have the same dilemma, that in their attempt to do theology or to do their type of kalam, they at one time were leaning upon philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, which was the foundation of Muslim kalam, along with the Quran and the Sunnah. But modernity and modern thinkers, they collapsed that foundation totally. And they became thinkers that expounded thought for kufr and disbelief. And part of it was because their religion didn't have a basis. And their religion projected them into areas of superstition and backwardness and so on and so forth. And so they rebelled. And so in their rebelling against distortion and untruth, they didn't have a guide. They didn't have revelation. And so without a guide and without revelation, those thought experiments led to the human being contradicting himself and herself. That's why we see now people are talking about they can be whatever they want to be. If they want to be an animal, they become an animal. If they feel that they are, they biologically they're a boy, now they want to be a girl. Or maybe they're going to be something in between. Or maybe they're just going to flow with everything. The human identity is completely wiped out. That's where this civilization is at. And it just doesn't stop at the whole issue of like sexual orientation as people think. No, this thing is going way beyond that to a whole concept, what we call it transhumanism. Beyond the whole issue of sexual orientation, which most of us are fixated on that problem, is the whole issue of the wiping out of the human being. Is going to be the interface between human beings and technology. And the value of the human being day by day is decreased. Do you understand? After all of the civil rights struggle, after all of the human rights struggle, in the context of the US American experiment for human dignity, there's a couple of things that have manifested themselves very clearly. Look at the reality of what? Look at the reality of how affirmative action has gone out the door. Society is not seeing a need to correct itself. And so there's a certain degree, of denial of what's taking place on the level of politics and on the level of science and in different areas and arenas, people. And so this is something that we really have to, understand this stuff clearly. Because if we don't understand it clearly, what's going to end being the case is that we're going to be in a bad place. There's no way, again, I said that the arguments of Ilm Kalam as they were are going to save us from anything. First of all, we have to orient ourselves in the Quran. And we need the Quranic framework. And then we may be able to borrow certain tools from Ilm Kalam, but that's not going to be enough. We need to be able to regroup on every intellectual discipline and infuse it with the constants and the principles of Iman. When you have in physics that the core reality of physics, even though Einstein doesn't deny something that it can be called God or whatever, but he's not necessarily thinking about God as we think about God. You know what I'm saying? Most of the physicists we're arguing in such a way that it was basically justifying the whole idea of kufr. That's where most of the physicists were at. You understand what I'm saying? And then they push to a point where they're pushing us to an idea that's not unsimilar to what some attribute to Ibn Arabi, where everything becomes God. How are those things going to safeguard humanity? You know what I'm saying? That's just the bottom line. There's a lot to be said on these types of fronts. And it definitely is not going to be done in any systematic, scholarly way with some YouTube rant or some Facebook Live event such as this. But I'm telling you, people, we have to become scholars again. We have to master knowledge at another level. And we have to learn from the mistakes of the past. We have to extremely ground ourselves in the Quran. And we have to learn that there's different modes of reasoning. And we have to realize that this crisis, we can safeguard ourselves at the basic level with practice and coming close to Allah. But the intellectual problems which are collapsing people, that's going to need way more work. It needs a civilizational response because it's a civilizational crisis. And without a civilizational response, we're always going to be in a position of weakness, right? And so that needs a renewal of intellect and the disciplines and so on and so forth. And we're not ready to have that discussion. It's a discussion that has been proposed for the last 100 years on what's needed for revival. And it goes unheeded. It goes unheeded by every single movement. Every single movement pretends to make their claim to revival. And at the end, what ends up happening is we come back to the same place again. Fighting each other and still no solutions and still turning to others for their guidance on how we orient ourselves to the world. And then what we do with that is we put a bismillah in front of it and we think that we're doing a good job. The Kalamists that make that claim, they have to do some work. We have to see how it is that their claims are going to be taken within the discussions on other branches of knowledge. Without that, it doesn't go anywhere. And I end on that note. Assalamu alaikum.